we discussed Plato's metaphysics and epistemology through what two vehicles found in the Republic? They have what nice names? We talked about the allegory of the cave.
And the dividing line.
Thanks, yeah, the divided line. And by the way, the person who has the most awareness of reality, and by the way, there's two levels of reality according to Plato in the divided line. Both levels of reality are knowledge of what things? It starts with an F. Yeah, thank you. True knowledge is knowledge of forms. Forms are defined as what? This is a little bit of recap. Forms are not things. Forms are ideas. Even though they can be applied to things sometimes, and sometimes things embody the forms. But forms are predominantly ideas. And the true forms are fixed, unchanging, eternal things. This is why one of the signposts to helping people along with realizing that there are things that are absolute and unchanging. Plato uses a lot of examples from what discipline? And by the way, they didn't think of it as a separate discipline. They thought of it as the language of the cosmos. Maths, yeah. Mathematics is that vehicle for pointing people towards the ideas that are fixed, eternal, and unchanging. And just as a little side note, which I mentioned last time, I'll mention it again. There's plenty of examples in Plato's dialogues that appeal to geometry. Geometry really is the language of the cosmos. Which of the pre-Socratic schools of thought also realize this?
The Pythagoreans.
Yeah, the Pythagoreans. If you wanted to understand the cosmos, it was best understood mathematically. And if you appreciate it aesthetically, you would recognize that it is a harmony. And it's beautiful. But yeah, learning mathematics is a sort of road to what he calls the higher forms. Now, the person who appreciates the higher forms has achieved this. This is what we call Platonic enlightenment. The person who achieves Platonic enlightenment has gotten out of the cave. Now, what are some of the markers of Platonic enlightenment? Such a person would actually be at peace with herself. Such a person, like Socrates, would realize all the things that really matter in this life. This life is a temporary thing. Even though it is possible that I might live again and again, as the Pythagorean myth of reincarnation speaks about, this life is a temporary thing. If I want to live the best way possible, what I need to do is to align myself with the forms. I realize that this kind of life is the best kind of life. And here is what Socrates and Plato meant by a life of moderation. It is what you will see in the text in the discussion of justice within the soul. Now, this is a very different way of talking about justice than 20th century Americans are used to talking about justice. When we speak of justice, we talk of giving the criminal justice by throwing him in jail or something like this. When Plato speaks of justice, he is speaking of this. He is speaking about getting the internal balance right, if I can use that expression. He is talking about getting the balance right. Now, what are we balancing? Now, this is important. You'll have to remember this. Plato conceived of the psyche, aka the human soul. Remember? That's the translation. Plato conceived of the soul as consisting of 3 parts. And to help you remember it, by the way, 3 was a powerful cosmic number, by the way. You know, the triangle was one of Plato's, perfect geometric forms. So I've decided to illustrate it this way. There are 3 parts to the soul, according to Plato. We have the rational part of us. We have the beastly part of us that he called the desire or the appetite. And the last part of us, which is somewhere in between these 2 things, he called the will or the spirit. In a very beautiful dialogue of Plato's, it's called Phaedrus, you don't have to remember it for the test. But one of the ways he tries to explain his theory of the soul to, well, a young man named Phaedrus who he was teaching, he says, imagine the soul as being like a charioteer who is guiding a chariot, and it's drawn by 2 horses. Now, the charioteer symbolizes the human part of us, the thing that is quintessentially human, our brains, our minds, our reasonable parts, our intellect. Now, one of the horses, he said, is extremely strong and untamed. It is unruly. It wants to run around and do whatever it wants to do. It lacks control. This horse is symbolized by the appetite. There is a smaller and feebler horse that requires direction. And the thing is, it is feeble to the point that it will take direction from whatever moves it. Take a guess what's trying to drive the will. The appetite is trying to drive the will, trying to bend the will to its drives. What Socrates in the dialogue says is, which part of this picture, which part of the soul should be in charge?
The intellect.
Yeah. The rational part, the quintessentially human part of us, should be running the show. But in many people it's what? Many people it's not. When the desire is running the show, you have a soul that is out of balance. And by the way, do you find a whole lot of people who get the balance right, according to Plato? No, you don't. The people who get this balance right will be rare. They will be the few people who have made it out of where?
The cave.
Yeah, who have made it out of the proverbial cave. Now, admittedly, it is possible to get people to behave as if the reason is in control. How? It's called external motivators. But for the enlightened person, where does the motivation to be balanced come from? Yeah, it comes from within. The person who has become enlightened has an intuitive knowledge that this kind of balance is a good life. And when this happens, when the reason takes charge of the will and bend the appetite to it, that is when the person has found, this is what he calls justice in the soul. And admittedly, people in this situation are very, very rare. Most people, will oftentimes allow their appetite to lead them astray. And by the way, this is not an inconsistent view with the kinds of viewpoints that later Neoplatonic Christians and Jewish folks would hold. Because those traditions were both influenced by Greek traditions. Have you heard of this before? But yeah, St. Augustine was heavily influenced by Platonism. Just to drop one name for you there. But yeah, the fleshly part of us is the weak part of us. The mind needs to bend the fleshly part of us into submission. So you can kind of see why in those traditions we are kind of taught to have a love-hate relationship with our bodies. Because it is our bodily desires that lead us to feed our various appetites. Now these appetites are not in themselves bad, because if I didn't have an appetite for food, what would happen? Yeah, I'd starve. You have to learn to moderate these things. If I didn't have an appetite for you-know-what, the circle of life couldn't go on. Do I need to spell it out vulgar? I hope not. Now, of course, if I let those appetites run amok, I won't get your homework graded. And a whole host of other things. I won't go into the disgusting details. I don't want to ruin your lunch or whatever. But you get the idea. If we did not have appetites, we would be in trouble. It's just that we can't let the appetites rule the show. When the appetites rule the show is when the soul lacks balance, when the soul lacks justice. Everyone ought to seek justice in the soul. But for those of you who read the last part of the chapter, you may have noticed, via Plato's political views, that the average Joe six-pack is really not well suited to becoming just on his own. The average Joe six-pack is not well suited to becoming just on his own. This is why he needs what to give him a hand? It's called wise leadership. This is the last part of the conversation. And unfortunately, I won't be able to do this as much justice as I'd like to. We just discussed Plato's psychology. We're going to culminate with Plato's discussion of his politics. Now, we've already talked about the fact that Plato had a very unfavorable view of which political system? Yeah, democracy. Well, the fact is, he actually had an unfavorable view of all three of those classical political structures. And those were democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. He argues that as long as one of those systems is in place, that it will be short-lived, because it has within it the seeds of its own demise, the seeds of its own decay. This is why he argues that society will not be well run until a radical political change is made. Because men's psyches are not so easily changed. And he believed that there was this. Let me write this on the board. The text says this. How many of you saw this in the text? The view that Plato believed there was a reciprocal relationship between the individual and society. To put that in blunt terms, Good societies tend to produce good citizens. Good citizens will tend to produce good societies. Bad societies will tend to produce bad citizens. You know how it goes. Bad citizens will tend to perpetrate bad societies. And that was kind of one of the problems with democracy. He says democracy is a chaotic system where the least and the greediest of us are the ones who are in charge. So it's no wonder that the democratic soul is materialistic and greedy. He believed that the democratic spirit is one that would not produce decent folks. Because we'd always be wanting what? Four-letter word, not a curse word. Yeah, more. The greedy appetite never has enough. It will always want more. It will never be satisfied. And if one's never satisfied, you'll never be happy. In other words, the mentality has to be taken out of us one way or another. Now, what he presupposes is a society that for some people looks like a kind of quasi-benevolent fascism, if I can use that phrase. He hypothesizes an ideal republic. His ideal republic meant something like this: rule by the wise. Now, what he proposed is that society has three primary functions. Thus, there will be three primary groups of people, or if you prefer to use the word classes. I don't like to use the word classes whenever I talk about Plato, because it invariably gives the student the wrong idea. Because Plato's society did indeed have a functional division of labor. Plato's society did have a functional division of labor. But and I don't think the text does this justice. His society would be this. It would be non-hierarchical. You know what I mean by a hierarchy? You people are all brought up to think of hierarchies as normal. Where some people are just better than other people, and they're more deserving than other people. Some people are less necessary, other people are more necessary. Some people shouldn't have even existed, other people we wish we had more of. That is the way we are taught to think about one another. Yeah, admit it. That's what makes me laugh about America, and I'm glad to go on film saying this. I don't feel bad about this. You know, we are taught about these ideals about equality and how we have no social classes and everybody's equal. We all know that's bunko. We know that in our system, we have certain people who we are taught are lesser and other people we are taught are better. And some of us want to fight against that kind of thinking. And I'll admit, I'm one of those people. We'd like to see something different. Yeah, for a classless society, you know, as we're called on paper, there's definitely an unwritten kind of class system in this society. Now, Plato's system indeed had quote-unquote classes, but it was non-hierarchical in this sense. Because everybody had a role to play, and Plato understood that everybody's role was necessary to the greater good of the whole. And the text does not do justice to this either. Plato loved to use metaphor and allegory. Plato conceived of society as like one of these. Plato conceived of society as being like an organism. You know, a living thing. A living thing has various parts. Each part has its function that it needs to perform and ought to perform. When the hands are trying to do the job of the feet, the whole organism fails. When the appetite is trying to do the job of the brain, the organism fails. By analogy, when the parts of the society are not doing what they are best suited to doing, the society fails. It might not fail right away. It will be in the midst of constant crumbling, if you will. Now, this is how Plato conceived the organism ought to be set up. I am going to put my triangle upside down intentionally. Because typically, whatever we put at the top, we tend to think of it as what? Yeah, it must be the best and the most important. And I want to dispel that myth. Plato understood that all parts of the state and all members of the society were necessary to the greater functioning of the whole. Now, the vast majority of people in society will be involved with production of one form or another. Because guess what? Bodies need to be fed. Goods and services need to be produced. These people will minister to the nutritive needs of society. The vast majority of people will be engaged in this kind of everyday production work. After all, and I'll use an American sort of metaphor, if we did not have farms, we would not have food. If we did not have people in the transportation industry, the food wouldn't get from the Midlands to New York City. The blue-collar worker is America's bread and butter. Wasn't that the cliche? The blue-collar worker is America's bread and butter. Simply because he's got dirt under his fingernails, and simply because he sits his butt in a truck 12 hours a day, doesn't mean we should think of him as a lesser human being. Because that's a job that what? It needs to get done. Yeah, you shouldn't be thumbing your nose up at other people, because everybody who works is a valuable component of society. Now, the next piece of society takes care of society's protection needs. These will be the warriors. The warriors will protect society from without and from within. Because our enemies aren't just potentially enemy states next door to us. We might have dangerous miscreants within our society who need to be watched and rooted out. And then finally, and by the way, this is probably too big of a triangle at the bottom. These are the people who would take care of the ordering needs. And by the way, there's more than one way to refer to these ordering needs people. I want you to know them both. Plato sometimes refers to them as philosopher kings. Another phrase that he will use to refer to these leaders will be this. He sometimes refers to them as guardians. I like the expression guardians very, very much. Because guardians, unlike kings, kings suggest a hierarchy. It suggests a guy sitting on a throne with a golden crown on his head, eating grapes and getting large. You know what I'm talking about, right? And it casts the wrong idea, because when people say kings, we get those impressions. These philosopher kings / guardians would not be living such lives. As a matter of fact, they would be living this. They would live very modest lives. And this is because, guess what? That's all they would want anyway. And number two, if we were to lavish glory and riches on them, what danger might we risk? They might end up becoming corrupt if we start to laud praise on them. Because even the enlightened have the potential of backsliding under the wrong conditions because the flesh is weak. Yeah.
So these philosopher kings and guardians would have to be enlightened.
Absolutely. Now, if I can give you a couple of contemporary mythologies that kind of put this idea forth and are also critical of it, and I guess various kinds of nerds in the audience, no offense to you, by the way, because I think my knowing as much of this stuff as I do puts me in that camp too. George Lucas's Jedi Knights is in a sense supposed to be an expression of what Plato's philosopher kings or guardians would be a little bit like. Remember, his Jedi Knights are supposed to be enlightened. They are supposed to be the best and the brightest. And remember, to avoid temptations such as fleshly pleasures, you're not supposed to go around with the ladies, if you will. You don't want to lay with her, young Skywalker. You'll be taken off the path. Well, of course, what happens? He is taken off the path. So yeah, all you need is one of these guardians to go off the rails. And you run a risk of crumbling the whole system according to this. Now guess what? I have another example for you. It might be difficult to find such Socrates people type anyway. For those of you who are familiar with the Lord of the Rings, and particularly the book The Fellowship of the Ring, that's the first in the three, to try to figure out what to do with the treacherous ring, they get the Council of Elrond together. So they show up in Rivendell, and these are supposed to be the best and the brightest, the noblest of all of the races of people of Middle-earth. And guess what you find out about these best and the brightest? Yeah, they're not that noble. As a matter of fact, they are arrogant enough to think that they can wield the ring of power. And they are too busy squabbling and fighting amongst themselves. And it's only the humblest and the least among them who comes forth and goes, I will ferry the ring to Mordor if you ask. In my Elijah Wood voice, if I had it. Yeah, the high and mighty and the people who actually think that they're wise as you know what, might be half the problem. It might be very difficult to actually find wise guardians in the first place. And I want to go into a little bit of detail here. If you read Plato's Republic, it's one of his longer works, but it is worth reading. When Socrates is asked, pray tell me, how would you set something like this up? Socrates is incredibly humble. And he says, I've thought about this a great deal, but I don't pretend to have all the answers. He says, however, I will do my best to give you something like a sketch of what this ideal state and its provisions would look like. He admits that these guardians they would have the longest of educations, and a little bit like George Lucas and his Jedi Knights, to draw that analogy back in here. Take a guess when the potential guardians would have to be uncovered. They would have to be discovered when they were young children. Can anyone guess what the obvious reason is why they'd have to be discovered early? Gaskins.
They haven't been tainted yet?
Perfect. Yeah, they haven't had the chance yet to get corrupted. The youth with the potential to become enlightened would be taken aside to live apart from the rest of society. Take a guess who they would take up residence with. They would take up residence with the guardians.